the Comet Houston event. We have Dr. Omar here with us today. We're going to be talking about bridging the gap between Islamic spirituality and practical psychology. And I'll hand it off for the introduction. Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم إن شاء الله. بسم الله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم أعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. Inshallah, we'll give a brief introduction to Sidi Omar, Dr. Omar Mahmood Mendoza here. We're very blessed to have someone of his caliber join us today in Houston. Alhamdulillah wa shukrillah. This is a city that always benefits by individuals of his caliber coming from outside and visiting us and imparting their excellent knowledge to the community. And so we're very honored to have him. I'll give a brief introduction to his background. It's very impressive. I don't want to praise him too much, but I think it's certainly worthwhile for all of us to hear what kind of background he has before he begins his talk, inshallah. We also want to thank my brother-in-law Jawad and all the organizers who've managed to help bring him down at short notice. And so Dr. Omar Mahmood is actually a clinical neuropsychologist by profession. I won't unpack what that actually means because I don't have a clue in terms of the nitty-gritty of neuropsychology. But I would say a few comments really quickly before I just give you his background. In the last decade or so, and I think Dr. Omar will agree with this, there's been a real push in the Muslim community in terms of therapy, psychology, and practices of the like. And sometimes this is being pushed by folks that have almost used it as a way to supersede the sciences of the ulum of tasawwuf and the Islamic spiritual aspects of this religion. And so it's predicated on a Freudian or a Jungian type of background without looking at what our own ulama have said. And I think the beauty of having Dr. Omar with us is that his background is both in the sciences from the Western perspective, is in this field, but he's also had the amazing opportunity of studying with some of the foremost scholars of our time in Hadramaut and Tarim and in other places. Anyone who knows anything about Hadramaut and Tarim, Allahumma barik lana fi shamuna wa yamnuna, that the Prophet ﷺ, aw kama qal, he said that bless us in the lands of Sham and bless us in the lands of Yemen. And the ulama from our tradition of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah have said that you can see the barakah of this dua from the ulama that have come from these two places. And if you look at where Tarim and Hadramaut is situated and the scholarly line that they've had for generations upon generations. We all know Imam al-Haddad, well, many of us know Imam al-Haddad radiallahu an, but even now in our times, Habib Omar bin Hafid, rahimullah, and many others have come from these places. And so, Dr. Omar, I wanted to start with his spiritual training first and foremost before I come into the dunyawi side of things, because it's very important for us to know who these scholars are. And he studied in Dar al-Mustafa and in other places. And so, blending that with his dunyawi sciences, he has a PhD, in fact, in neuropsychology. He's also studied as a clinical director of psychology and clinical neuropsychology at Sidra Medicine, which was Sidra Hospital, in Qatar. And so he has his license both in California and in the Middle East, in the Khalij and Qatar as well. And so he's seen a diverse group from this ummah and others outside of the ummah too, who have required an understanding of how, issues in terms of neurologically and how that impacts their daily interactions. And so this is really crucial. What he's going to talk about today is the blending of the two, the understanding of this science with the Islamic spiritual aspect. And so I think that's really what gives him so much kudos. And so without further ado, it just behoves me to give that introduction to who he is. But I'll pass it on to him, someone who can speak far better than I can. So inshallah, wabillahi tawfiq. Thank you very much. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to say the format is that he'll speak for about half an hour on his talk, and then inshallah there'll be time for ample time for question and answer session before we go into Isha, inshallah.
Bismillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. Alhamdulillah, I'm thankful and grateful to be here with you all. It's a blessing just to have a community where you can gather, you can remember Allah, we can pray, and then it's the added benefit of we're in the Rabi al-Awwal now, the blessed month of the birth of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I pray that we gather and we obtain these barakats from Allah as He showers them upon us. and that we, keep our intentions as pure as we can, and try to seek closeness to Allah. My journey as a Muslim psychologist, it took many years and different exposure to different kinds of knowledge and people. And what happened was, when I was getting ready to go to my graduate program in clinical psychology, I made Umrah, and this is the late 1990s, and in the journey to Mecca and Medina, I met some of my teachers, some of the scholars from Hadramaut, and in that I had someone give me some advice, and that was Dr. Mustafa al-Badawi. He translates a lot of the books of Imam al-Haddad, and he is a psychiatrist himself, and he gave me a piece of advice, which was, if I'm going to go to a Western oriented psychology program, then he said, then the first thing you should do is go to Tarim, go to Yemen, and see some of the traditional scholars there, so that you could learn something about their knowledge of the nafs. The nafs meaning, the internal state of who you are, your ego, that inner spirit that can sometimes lead you to astray, and how you can discipline the nafs. And it's very interesting that in the term psychology, which is based on a Greek term, it almost translates almost exactly to ilm al-nafs, the knowledge of the psyche, that could be your soul, it could be that internal voices that you have something within. And in modern psychology, we're supposed to be studying the ilm of the nafs, the knowledge of the nafs. And so what better place to start than the scholars of our great tradition of Islam. And I'm not a scholar. I never became like a sheikh in that way. I was just a student of learning, talab al-ilm, just seeking the knowledge. But those lessons from my teachers was very valuable for me when I went into grad school, because then you get this filter, a sort of an awareness, so that when you get exposure to a lot of the more modern or Western theories and approaches, I could easily discern and kind of filter out what are the things that I'll take and use that are beneficial, and nah. Nah. Can you? Maybe it's better if I hold it. Um, one of the things that I want to share. Bismillah. Oh, it's is that I would started to hear statements from keeps cutting in and out, right? Sorry. We'll try our best, inshallah. Bismillah. Okay. Inshallah, we'll get it eventually. One of the qualities of the believer is sabr, having patience, and sometimes Allah will test you with patience. So, mashallah, it's good to have these lessons. What I would start to hear is like in khutbahs, for example, you would have the imam say something, and I had directly had this quote from an imam once in the Jumu'ah khutbah, and he said, "If you have strong iman, you will never have depression." And I was thinking on, and I was in the audience. I later came up to the imam and spoke to him and wanted to explain to him that I understand where he was coming from. If many people in our community will say, if you just strengthen your iman, then you'll never have any depression. You'll have no anxiety, all of these things about mental health. You won't have any problems because you'll have strong iman. And the only, I think, the theory of it is fine, which is, of course, if you're closer to Allah and you have strong iman and you have tawakkul in your heart and you're really relying on your Lord, then of course you will start to realize that this dunya is very, fleeting, and that we believe in the akhirah. And so most of the problems in this world, you'll start to realize, become minimized for you, because you realize we have a greater purpose as Muslims. So I understand the theory that he was coming from, but the wording, unfortunately, is unfortunate, is the part that, that I had an issue, which is if you say to someone, if you have strong iman, you'll never be depressed. The problem is, in the congregation, in the group of the people, in the jama'ah, people who are coming to the masjid and sitting and listening, maybe listening to the words from the imam during the khutbah, among them are people who are depressed. They're going through something in their life, or they're having some kind of, difficulty, a stress in their life, and they're feeling quite depressed. And then they come to the masjid to maybe have some solace, some peace, some comfort. And they're told in the Jumu'ah khutbah, if you only had iman, then you wouldn't have any of these problems. And so now he had a psychological problem. Now added on to that, a spiritual problem. He's being told that his iman is weak. Maybe he doesn't really believe. And so for many years, what I've been trying to focus on is that we have to separate iman and your faith with your mental health well-being. Those are two different things. Similar to your physical, health, if someone is afflicted with a sickness, could be anything, diabetes, cancer, could be an injury in your body, some kind of, medical condition that you need medication for. If someone is afflicted with a medical condition, nobody comes to them and tells them, if you only had more iman, if you had stronger belief in Allah, you would avoided all of this. You see, it doesn't make sense as an analogy. And then when you when you look in it, more deeply into the issue, you realize that there are so many examples in our tradition of people who have very, very strong iman, but who were tested with mental health issues, whether it be depression, anxiety, worry. These are things that afflict even the best of us, even to the point of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We all know in the seerah, and this is a blessed month to review the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to remember his life and to review his life, his biographical history. There's a year in his life which we call Aam al-Huzn, a year of sadness. And there were many stressors in his life at that time. He lost his wife, he lost his guardian, his whole community was being oppressed. And nobody would ever doubt the Imam of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Nobody would doubt his faith, his connection to Allah. But to be described as having a year of sadness, that's from a clinical perspective, we worry if someone has like 2, 3, 4 weeks of depression. If you get to 6 months, then you probably will be diagnosed with something, an adjustment disorder with depressive symptoms, possibly major depression. 1 year of sadness that's beyond. That's a major test, But we would never separate, we would never somehow connect that to the strength of that person. Similarly, the Anbiya in general were tested. We know that the most, people who are tried to the highest level of ibtila, of testing from Allah, those are the Anbiya. The prophets and the messengers, they're the ones who were tested the most. So you have also the example of Sayyidina Yaqub, when he loses Yusuf and he cries to the point that he becomes blind. Again, that's huge amounts of despair or sadness. I wouldn't say despair, but sadness. So even as a clinical psychologist, we ask patients, how long have you been crying? How frequently are you crying? Your mood, is it low? Is your sleep, disturbed? Is your appetite? All of these things. And then you have a prophet who literally cries his eyes out. Again, huge amounts of emotional stress. How much stress, Sayyidina Yaqub must have been to know that he lost his son to the point that he's blind. So again, these points kept recurring. And Sayyidina Yunus, he's in the belly of the whale, of the fish, and he's turning to Allah. Oh Allah, I've been oppressing myself, and he's in this state of darkness. His name was, one of his names was Dhannun, like in the Quran. وَذَنُّونَ إِذْ ذَهَبَ فَغَاضِبًا فَظَنَّ أَنْ لَن نَقْدِرَ عَلَيْهِ فنادى في الظلمات أن لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. So he turns in his very, very like tight and constricted emotional state. He turns to Allah. And it's described, he's in dhulumat, he's in darkness. And so he turns to Allah. So the nice thing, the beautiful thing about our deen, about Islam, is that we have ways to support our mental health. You can turn to a greater being. You can turn to your Lord, your own Lord, and speak directly to your own Lord in your dua and your dhikr and your recitations. And you can turn and make tawbah to Allah. And that's a great blessing for us. So your Islamic spirituality is actually meant to support your mental health, because we know that this world will be filled with tests and tribulations. Al-mu'min mubtala. A believer will be afflicted with some kind of test. We've known that since the beginning. That's the sunnah of the dunya that Allah has established in this world. There's always tests and tribulations. But we're equipped, thankfully, in our deen, we're equipped with ways to support our mental health. So this is very important because we all know that we're afflicted at times in our lives, and you can look at it clinically. If you look at statistically, over a lifetime, almost every one of us will have at least one episode where we get very depressed or very anxious. Depression is when you're sad about something that happened in your past. And anxiety is usually thought as worry about something in your future. So you have al-huzn. Huzn is sadness for things that have passed. And khawf or qalaq is worry and anxiety about things in the future. And you have, the idea is that you should always, as best you can, be in your present moment. Don't be worried about your future, and don't be too sad about your past. We can't change the past, and the future hasn't come to you yet. You don't know about it, so why are you so worried about it? So, but as human beings, we're always afflicted at some point, and so when you think about the definition of paradise, al-firdaus, we have all these descriptions of what is the paradise going to be? What is it going to be for the believers who enter into the paradise? And we know that there's descriptions of what it will look and what will be inside, and what are the treasures and what are the things that are beautiful inside. But what's very interesting is when you look in the Quran and you describe people who are going to the paradise, very frequently is the idea فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ لَا يَحْزُنُونَ. Everybody who enters in the paradise, they have no fear and they have no depression. There's no sadness. That لَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ لَا يَحْزُنُونَ, that statement is repeated many times in the Quran. Almost to remind us, in this dunya, yes, we all have moments of fear, worry, anxiety, and then we also have sadness and depression. There's tragic things in our lives, traumatic things in our lives. But it's almost as if the Quran, Allah is reminding us, but this is just the dunya. When you get to paradise, there is no fear and there's no sadness. And so when you think about it that way, then you have a different way of describing the paradise. It's basically the lack of the fear and anxiety and sadness that we see in this world. You just remove it, and that is one of the descriptions of the paradise. So for the believer, our deen, allows us to use these ways to remember the reality, and then you can sort of calm yourself down and realize and remind yourself, okay, yeah, there's, it's meant for me to face these challenges. And of course, there's the well-known verse, ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب. Indeed, by dhikr, by remembrance, the hearts feel that serenity. The hearts feel a sense of peace. So the dhikr, and the dhikr can be all kinds of forms of dhikr. The dhikr could be prayer, it could be recitation of the Quran, it could be doing adhkar, yawmiyan, the day and the morning and the afternoon, dhikrs and awrad, reciting different du'as. All of these things are ways to get remembrance. And when you're in that state of remembrance, your heart starts to feel a sense of peace. And in our tradition, we have to kind of make that a normal practice, so that every day you're engaged in some form of dhikr, some way to remind yourself that all of these, challenges and tribulations that we will feel and we'll face in our lives, we will have to have a context and realize, is it really that bad? But if you don't have that, if you don't have that sense, it's very difficult to live in the world. And so I'll see many patients, for example, who don't have any spiritual tradition. They don't have any even belief at all. Some of them, they're towards the end of their life and they're just in a nursing facility, and if they don't have that spiritual sense and that remembrance of the next life, then it's unfortunately, it's a very, very difficult state to be in, where you basically, everything seems wretched. Everything seems like you're in this kind of torment all the time, being tortured. Whereas if you have this spiritual understanding, you have a way to look at it in a different way. So, one of the things that we try to, focus, if I'm working with a Muslim who's looking very negatively at life and looking at, why are all these things happening to me and I can never get the success that I want. When you get into a state of depression, you do tend to look at things very, very negatively. And what happens is you focus only on the negative things, and usually you ignore the good things in your life. You ignore a lot of the positives because your mind is focused on a very negative way of looking at the world. And so you have to have this way to remind yourself. And it's best to do it not only in your worst times, not in the times of bala, but also in the times of just good times. Constantly reminding yourself, prepping yourself, so that you have that resilience psychologically for the one day that you will have a stressful day. You might have some good days, but you should be engaging in that dhikr anyways, in your spiritual practice, and you're looking at your reflection on the blessings of Allah. Because one day you might have a very stressful day, but if you've already adjusted and acclimated yourself as a way to remind yourself and connect to Allah and have that remembrance, then even when you have a stressful day, you're well equipped. You just use the same routine you've been doing before. And that's why the idea of awrad, or the wird, or sometimes, regular dhikr, is a way to kind of protect your well-being, your mental health, so that even you don't use it just on the down times, you do it on the up times as well. It becomes a regular practice of who you are. And then you're resilient when you actually do face those challenges in life. So, وتولى عنهم وقال يا أسفا على يوسف. When, of course, when Yaqub, when he was in that state of sadness, sorrow over the loss of Yusuf, and he said, you know, he cries his eyes out. What's very interesting is that the physical body gets affected as well by your mental health. So there's a lot of studies now on the psychosomatic connections, so that even if you're very anxious, for example, and it's because of something psychological and not even something necessarily physically that happened to you, but you can start having panic symptoms. You can start having your heart rate going faster, your breathing, shortness of breath. You can't control yourself. You might be have some trembling, nervousness, GI problems. Your digestion. All of this can be affected simply because of that mental state that you're in. So there's a link between the somatic, the physical symptoms, and the actual psychological state. And this is addressed in our tradition, in the Quran, and in the Sunnah. And of course, there's the famous dua of the Prophet ﷺ, where he's, we say it in the Word Latif every morning. اللهم إني على ذكرك اللهم إني أعوذ بك من الهم والحزن وأعوذ بك من العجز والكسل وأعوذ بك من الجبن والبخل وأعوذ بك من غلبة الدين وقهر الرجال. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from the khawf and the hazan. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from worry and sadness. The Prophet ﷺ in this dua, is a well-known dua that the Prophet ﷺ taught us. He lists a number of tribulations that you could go through in life. A lot of them, and they're really stressful things to go through. The inability to do something. You're constricted. Or the opposite. You have the ability, but you're lazy. You don't have the motivation. For some reason, you're not finding that motivation. Fear and a miserliness, like I don't want to, you're being kind of, you're not generous, you're not being able to generous enough. The worry of overwhelming debt. You're caught in debt, and you owe all these bills, and financially it's very stressful. Or the powering of men, that you literally just get oppressed by other people, other humans who physically just put you down. These are all, terrible, tribulations to go through. But what's very amazing about this dua, the first thing that the Prophet ﷺ said, out of all those things he could have listed, the debt or overpowering men, the first thing he says in that dua is, oh Allah, I ask for your refuge in you from worry and sadness. That's the first thing he mentions out of all these other things. Because the human experience is that we all will have these in life. And in fact, it's so common, it's the first thing that the Prophet ﷺ would say in that dua in the morning about, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan. Oh Allah, I need you, I need your protection from worry and sadness. So to me, that very validates the idea that people will go through this. It's well documented, and it's pretty much understood that the human being goes through these states. And when the Prophet ﷺ had to experience his own child, Sayyidina Ibrahim, when he died as a child, he said, the eyes send their tears and the heart is saddened, but we do not say anything except that which pleases our Lord. Indeed, O Ibrahim, we are bereaved by your departure from us. See if I can pull it up. So he says, إن العين تدمع والقلب يحزن. The Prophet ﷺ says it's normal. Your eye will tear up. You will cry. And your heart will feel very sad. But we don't say anything except that which pleases Allah. You might have some feelings inside. The Prophet ﷺ says, just don't say anything outside that would displease Allah. And then he said, "O Ibrahim," to his son who just passed away, وَإِنَّا بِفَرَائِقَكَ يَا إِبْرَاهِيمُ لَمَحْزُونُونَ. And Ibrahim, when you died, we were afflicted with sadness when you left. And the Arabic is very fascinating, because the Prophet ﷺ, he says, in that moment, we were afflicted with sadness. He says, لَمَحْزُونُونَ. Like, in other words, it was something that just came upon them. The sadness comes to you in certain times in your life. It makes sense. You just lost one of your loved ones. It's okay to feel that type of depression and sadness. And it's not necessarily your choice. It just comes to you sometimes. And you have to grieve. When you lose someone, you have to grieve and you have to heal from it and recover. But you can never fully complete that hole in your heart. Just one of the psychological theories is that when you lose someone, the heart, you get, your psychological makeup creates a hole in who you are. When the Prophet, there's a hadith Qudsi, when Allah asks the angels to take the child of one of the believers, and He says, أَقَبَدْتُمْ ثَمَرَةَ فَؤُودِ أَقَبَدْتُمْ وَلَدَ عَبْدِ. Allah tells the angels, did you take the soul of the son of my servant? The angel said, yes. And then he says, أَقَبَدْتُمْ ثَمَرَةَ فُؤَادِهِ. Did you pluck the fruit from his heart? And the angels respond, yes, Ya Allah. When we took his son, we removed something from him, like a hole in him. فَمَا قَالَ لِعَبْدِي. And what did my servant say at that moment? The angels reply, he said, حَمِدَكَ وَاسْتَرْجَعَ. He said, Alhamdulillah. And he said, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. So when you lose someone or something, there will be a hole in who you are. And in the psychological realm, there's a lot of theory about grieving. And when you're grieving someone, that hole, you can never fill it. The best you can do is just build your psychological state around it. So as you grow with time, you'll not always feel pain about the loss. You'll have some sadness always, but you'll learn to move on in life. But you'll always have that one hole that you can never fully fill in. Your psychological makeup will go around that hole, but it won't fill it. So I've always felt that it's very fulfilling to know that the Prophet ﷺ, the companions, all of the Anbiya, all of the great examples of our tradition, they've all experienced these human conditions. So it connects us to us. It makes us feel more like, okay, we're all humans, and this is all the journey that we're trying to get through. And it's okay if you have these emotional states and you have psychological problems. It's okay. There are ways that you can recover from it. Now, most of us, if you have a good sense of well-being and if you have a good routine, you will normally recover with time. If you get some support, you have some family and love of people that you love around you, normally you will heal with time. It's the same with physical training as well. If you have a good physical routine and you have exercise, you keep your physical body as intact as you can. If you get in an accident one day or you get tripped over, your injury will likely not be as bad because you've had a well-being of physical health that's been part of your routine. It's exactly the same with your psychological state and your spiritual state. If you have a practice where you can engage with and have a way to help yourself understand why am I going through all these things in life, you start to realize, oh, the akhirah is my actual goal, not this world. Then when you are afflicted with something, you're much more equipped. You have more resilience. And then this is something that our scholars have focused on when it comes to training your nafs, training your psyche inside of you so that you can respond in healthy ways to the different tests and tribulations that you face. I think at this point, I'd like to just open it up. If anybody had any, comments and questions, or wanted to follow up or clarify anything, please,
Any questions? Raise your hand. I can bring the mic to you, and then feel free. Oh, we got two right here.
Assalamu alaikum, Sidi. I just wanted to ask you, maybe from your background, if you can share your thoughts on medicine and psychiatry, but more specifically, like psychedelic mushrooms and psilocybin and kind of like more alternative. I'm talking about in a controlled, like with a professional setting, like because when I kind of looked into it, a lot of the man-made medicines and stuff, like they're band-aid solutions that have a lot of side effects. They're not looking at the human being holistically. But when you look at something like fungi, the mycelium networks and stuff, like the rich connectivity kind of models our mind. And I just want to know like what Islam says about it, because I'm sure it's not nothing.
MashaAllah, yeah. Okay, we're going right off the bat. So I'm a clinical psychologist, so I don't work with medication. That would be a psychiatrist. So I have a PhD in psychology, but we work with the MD, who's a psychiatrist. So sometimes we'll share the same patient, and I'll refer the patient to him, or he'll refer the patient to me, because we both realize that medication is useful at times, because especially if somebody has a very, very severe symptoms, where if you're so depressed that you're almost having like psychotic episodes and you can't even express yourself properly, then the medication might help to reduce those symptoms. So then you're ready to come to the psychologist, and then we can talk about the pain and what happened and what's in your life that's impacting you. But I can't do that if the patient is so severe, right, in their symptoms that I can't even engage with the person. So the medication is helpful. It's not a core cure. Similar to like if you got injured in your shoulder and you go, okay, just give me some Tylenol, Advil, I need the medicine. Okay, then you'll notice the pain will go down. It will address the symptom, but it will not address the core reason of why you got that pain to begin with. Oh, you might need a surgery, or you might need some physical therapy or something. That's the real thing that'll help you. But the symptoms, if they're so overwhelming, you need the medicine sometimes. So your question about psychedelics, there are some clinical trials now where they're using various plant-based medicines And, I do believe that, as a Muslim, I do believe that there are cures that Allah has He's placed in this world, and we have to find them. And makes sense that, we have herbal traditions, we have, plant-based, knowledge that indigenous people have known for centuries. And like, it makes sense that there will be some benefit. So I think it just has to be, responsibly done. Like, it can't just be done willy-nilly. But there are obviously cases where, people are already using clinical trials for like, I think ketamine and other types of they extract the chemical quality of the plant or the fungi. There's a lot of cases, also studies on CBD as well. You take the cannabidiol out of the plant, and it seems that it has actual brain behavior effects. So from my perspective, if it's, as long as it's within the realm of like medical knowledge, it has to be vetted, of course. And actually right now, this weekend, I think there's a paper being presented at the American Imams Conference. And there's actually a whole debate about that. Like, they all acknowledge it. They just have differences on the limits. Like, how far should you go? Should it really only for a patient who's very severe? But if they're more moderate, that kind of conversation, I don't have privy to. Like, I'm not at that level. But I do believe that like these naturalistic cures or medications that can help, I think are valid, especially if they've been well vetted.
Assalamu alaikum. What's the most common Muslim anxiety that you've come across, and what's the most common Muslim depression that you've come across?
That's a great question. So when I was in Qatar, I was living there for 6 years, and I was the director of psychology. So we had a team of psychologists in the hospital, and we would track the diagnoses that we would find in the Muslim. It was a majority Muslim population that we were treating, and actually it turns out it's almost the exact same diagnoses that you would find in any clinic around the world. The most common will be generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, and then some form of depressive disorder. Could be just a mild depressive state, or it could be more major depression. Those were the most two common things that we would see in our clinic amongst just Muslims. And it makes sense that was the normal across the world. Like, it's a kind of a human, condition based on your life that you're going through, circumstances and challenges. So they had the Muslims have the same types of depression and anxiety that you do find in the larger society. We do have some unique things. So for example, there's a type of anxiety, it's called OCD. And some Muslims have it related to their spiritual practice, so their wudu and tahara and making sure they're clean. Sometimes they get into an OCD state because of that. So I've had some cases where the patient came literally just because about their wudu, and like it was impacting their day to day. Like, wudu should take you like 5-7 minutes, but if it takes you 15-25 minutes to do wudu, something's wrong psychologically, because there's anxiety about, did I do this right? Did I do not? So there are cases where, they're more specific to our practices as Muslims. But I would say generally, we have the same diagnoses in frequency that you do in general society.
There's a sister.
Assalamu alaikum. Okay, so I was a little curious. I know that there's different types of anxieties, things like familial, racial, societal, whatnot. And all of those things, maybe we can find examples in the prophets or at the time of the prophet, just like relating to that as something that we can derive insight from. One thing, maybe I'm biased for saying this, one thing that I think is really unique to Gen Z or maybe the society we live in right now is eco anxiety. So, just like anxiety about the environment, the state of the world. Obviously, we hear news every day about the climate and it changing. People are changing the way they live and like, should I have kids? Should I not have kids? I'm wondering if in your practice you've ever seen any sort of precedent or example for eco anxiety or if it's just like any other type of anxiety. Eco anxiety? Yeah.
Yeah, mashallah, that's a great question. There are some differences now with generational changes because the technology and social media and the way that younger people, I mean, it's not just younger people, but younger people in the younger stages of their life, I would say, they're exposed to much more various kinds of influences socially, and so how they're meant to think about it, so like even am I representing the way that I should be, or am I living up to the certain expectation that the others are around me? And a lot of it has to do with what they see on social media, and so I think there is some unique things for the younger generation where they're facing this. This is going to be one of their challenges, which is there's a sense of it's a type of anxiety for sure, where like you don't know how you fit into others, and am I making, am I somehow fulfilling who I'm supposed to be, based on the expectations that are set all around them. Could be from family, from society, peer group, and these type of things. So it definitely is there. We just don't have enough data, like in a long-term sense, because these things are only happening in the last like 10 years, 20 years, But normally you want to see longitudinally, like, will this persist, going forward? That I don't know yet, but I definitely we have a number of cases that I've seen young adolescents who come in, Muslims who are very anxious about their identity and how they can portray themselves towards others. And it's almost like they have, because I feel like in my generation you could choose to not ignite, don't have to engage in social media, you don't have to like have this kind of mass way to project yourself to others. But in the younger generations, like it's almost like it's given, you have to have some kind of way to portray yourself. And so I definitely think that it is something that we have to kind of keep an eye on. But in general, we have to disconnect from technology as much as we can. I'm saying that I have a laptop right in front of me, but meaning your day-to-day life is already inundated with technology. So in your personal life, it would behoove us to limit our own technology use, simply because your day-to-day life, you're going to face it anyways. Work, school, you're going to face the technology around you. So when you have private moments, those are your times to disconnect and kind of, take the prophetic example and just find a cave and I'm not necessarily physically, I'm saying, but like even mentally go to a place where you can disconnect. Oh, you're saying ego? I said ego. Eco anxiety about climate. Yeah. So, it's very interesting is that it has a lot to do with, again, what you're portrayed on the media, and what you look at and what you feel is happening around the world, if you go to some, villages and places of the world, this is not like an issue, because it's not an issue that's placed in front of them that they have to face, and somehow your generation has to figure it out. But there are, in I would say, in the modern world, and in large advanced places where they have this issue keeps coming up, you do have cases where people find a lot of anxiety about the environment and about whether or not we can sustain this moving forward. But I would say, if I'm going to be honest, like, it's still a small percentage compared to the larger types of patients that we come to see in the clinics. There are cases where people will be anxious about that, but it's not. It's a smaller percentage compared to these other forms of anxiety.
Yeah. We'll do one over there, one over here.
Assalamu alaikum. So my question is regarding the, like, I guess your studies, right? So you said you did your PhD here, and as Muslims, we have the concept of nafs and ruh, right? Whereas here, it's not really addressed, or it's kind of removed from the study. So how does one go about furthering their studies in the field of psychology? As, like, how were you able to navigate through what you need to take and what you need to leave? And then also, my other, like, the other part to this question is, when it comes to practice, how do you navigate that? Because there's, like, non-Muslim patients, and then especially with Muslim patients, like, because I feel like doing a little bit of reading on the nafs and, like, the Islamic perspective on psychology, it plays a huge role, and it can really, really help a person, like, get better, or I guess cope better with some of the psychological issues. So how does, like, I guess from your, like, clinical practice, how did you go about it?
That's a great question. Are you someone who's interested in mental health? So, no, that's a great question, because we need a lot of Muslims to get into the field of mental health, but you're still coming from your spiritual perspective as well, and then you're taught in your school, your grad school. You're going to go through a master's program, maybe a doctorate, level, and you're going to face all these theories and practice and techniques and strategies, and you have to figure out which of these can I use as a Muslim, and I can accept it into my being and my use and my practice. And there are other things that I can't really, I can't jive with that. I don't have harmony with that. I have to set it aside because it doesn't resonate with my spiritual perspective. So part of that is, like I said, when I went to Yemen and I studied, with these teachers, just to help me understand the nafs and how the human can fail or get success based on these spiritual realities. And then I had to also kind of constantly check in. Like, even though I've been licensed since 2010. But I still will go and I'll talk to my teachers and sheikhs and people, about certain situations to make sure that my understanding is still sound, about, the idea of, Iman and Islam and Ihsan, the facets of who we are as Muslims. And sometimes I have to give scenarios and be like, I was, giving the patient this such advice, but does it make sense? And I'll always check in. So one of the things about, a good mental health practitioner is that you'll always seek consultation, and you'll always seek supervision. because maybe someone else can give you a new perspective, or just help you reset your way, so to make sure that you're following the same sort of, pathway towards, from the Muslim perspective. I think once you get it inside of you and you have a spiritual sense, you don't necessarily, it works for Muslim and non-Muslim. It's a human condition. Same thing. If I was a doctor and doing a surgery, I would do the same for a Muslim as I would for a non-Muslim, right? It's the same idea for psychology. It's just that the terminology might change. Like if I'm with a Muslim, I can easily use various terms and words and vocabulary that we would all understand. But if it's a non-Muslim, I will actually give a lot of the same concepts about, the fear and the anxiety and the resilience, and how you have to have your a practice, instead of maybe dhikr, I might say like a meditative practice, something so you keep reminding yourself about these goals and strategies in your life. So the same concept applies. I just don't necessarily use the same terminology with them, unless they ask me. Sometimes they'll ask me very specifically. Then if they open it, then I'll do that. But like in the Western world, you can't just start that, from a mental health clinician perspective, simply because we have ethics and we have certain license requirements. But if there's an opening and they want to ask about more spiritual things, we can definitely go into that. But it has to be from their end initially.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Thank you for being here. I'm going to try to formulate my question around an idea that I was just thinking about, which is the idea that we have certain people in society that have greater resiliency during, like for example, you can find an individual that may have a lot of negativity happening around them, or somebody may have passed and they may have financial issues, or they could be under any type of pressure. And you find some of these people that are very resilient and they have the capacity to endure and still enjoy or whatever their situation. And then there are people that have, one thing can happen that the other person might consider minor, but it can completely collapse that person. So there's, basically a lot of different types of people, but there are certain people that have a great deal of capacity to endure stress, and it doesn't bother them. And then there's some people that have much less capacity to endure. So I don't know if that has something to do with, how they were, psychological issues that are related to their childhood, or this is just some kind of a genetic sort of fluke that somebody that has those capabilities. But I just wanted to see what your thoughts are on that. And I did understand that there's things that a person can do to increase their capacity, as you mentioned previously. But the idea is kind of amazing that some people have such higher capacities and some people have less. Is that like just a fluke of nature, or is there like a process that an individual can undertake that would dramatically increase that capacity to endure? And just to finalize that, I mean, I've known people that were in really terrible situations, living in communities that gang violence, drugs, people going to jail. And some of those guys are just some of the most beautiful, amazing, resilient people. And they hear about problems that, say, upper middle class person is having, and they find that hilarious, that is actually bothering them. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. I could have probably asked you this question privately, since we're kind of hanging out together, but I wanted to see if you could talk about that as well. Thank you.
For one more question.
Okay. Yeah. That's a great question. Jazakallah khair. I think resilience is, there's many factors. Some of it is genetic. It just happens to be certain families, genetically, they have more vulnerability and sometimes more resilience. You know, I mean, a very obvious example is just substance use. There's a very clear genetic connection, you know, with alcoholism and drug use. If you had someone in your family that is vulnerable to that, it's a good chance it may be within your genes, and literally you just take 1 or 2 drinks and suddenly you're an alcoholic. Whereas other people, they'll experiment and then they don't become alcoholic. So there's a genetic connection for a lot of these vulnerabilities. In depression and anxiety, you can find it, you can trace it in the actual family line. That, oh, yeah, it makes sense. That one, you know, generation ago, we had an auntie or grandparent who did this, and it might repeat in the family later. Then you have just brain chemical changes that could be taking. That's why you might need medications, you know, temporarily for some reason. There could be other injuries in the baby's development in the womb of the mother, you know, that will affect the resilience of that person as they grew up. Early childhood experiences as a young person, if you're exposed to just toxic things, you know, physically or, you know, mentally, or you're exposed to just, you know, very, you know, poor, you know, situations where you don't have much nurturing, you don't have much support, you might be facing a lot of traumatic things in your life. So early childhood experiences may come out later and you'll see the differences. And then all kinds of things in between, social, you know, the spiritual practice that we talked about, if you have a community versus if you don't have a community, all of these factors will come into play. Do you have a good relationship with your family or not? You know, these type of things. Your diet, even. What do you eat? How much sleep do you have? All of these things will be, you know, we'll always look at it from when we're taking our initial clinical interview, the first intake. We're always asking all of these factors because we're trying to figure out the history of this person. So all of these factors are there, and then, you know, so if you, you know, some people will have to work at it a little bit you know, with a little bit more regularity and motivation because they have a vulnerability from the get-go. And other people, they seem to be resilient right away. They don't need much to kind of maintain it. So the person has to always also realize, if you realize like, yeah, you know, I'm kind of like a very anxious person. So I need to probably have more of my this positive self-talk and make sure I'm calming myself and realizing I'm not getting, you know, like making everything a catastrophe in my mind. You make these, if you make a normal practice of attending to that, you'll have a better chance. Whereas the other person who doesn't have that anxiety to begin with, he may only need a few reminders here and there. So it definitely will affect your strategy if you have certain vulnerabilities to get, you know, in the beginning. And then, you know, as parents, we want to instill as much resilience as we can to our children, which means we have to have a good balance, a lot of love and nurture and guidance, but then you also have to expose your kids to some challenges in life, because we know at some point they're going to get facing some challenges in life. But if you overprotected the child, then when it comes to their own personal, you know, challenges in life, and they've never faced any challenges when they were young because their parents always protected them, then they're not well equipped for life. So you kind of have a balance where make sure the child has some adventure, some challenges in life, a little bit of a danger that's, you know, with your supervision, so they understand that the world is a place of tests and tribulations.
All right, so that'll conclude our session for now. We're going to start praying. It's almost Isha time, so Jazakallah khair for Dr. Omar for coming by and giving a fantastic lecture. Once again, if you guys are interested in